Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on non-dilutive funding for clinical stage research. My name is Jonathan Adalist from the Fremont Group. I'll be giving the webinar today. And let's get straight into it. First of all, a few words about who's speaking with you today. So the Fremont Group has been around for about 17 years now. And we try to help, in a nutshell, our clients raise funding from non-dilutive sources. At the moment, about 55 full-time employees, and we work across the life sciences, industry, small biotech startups, and all the way up to big pharma, and with academics, university medical centers, research institutes, pretty much across the board. Submit at the moment 400, even sometimes 450 applications a year on behalf of our clients. And the way we go about doing that is, first of all, viewing non-dilutive funding as a strategic financial tool, and we are actually, in many ways, a tool you can use to maximize your potential for this type of funding. We help you identify the most relevant funding opportunities for your research projects, strategize to maximize each application's chances of success. We manage the complex project production processes, some multi-PI, multifaceted projects. We help manage that whole thing. We lead the joint application writing process and also support contract negotiations when that is relevant. But enough about us. Let's get into what we're actually here to discuss today, and that is funding for clinical activities. So first of all, taking a look in general at the non-dilutive pocket of money out there, it's currently estimated about a little bit over $50 billion a year going out through this type of mechanism to fund R&D activities. The largest source is the NIH and its 27 institutes and centers. But also BARDA, FDA, CDC, NSF. BARDA and the FDA would be especially relevant for today's webinar. The Department of Defense does a lot of funding, and again, the CDMRPs within the Department of Defense are extremely relevant for clinical activities, and private foundations as well. If you look at the NIH budget, excuse me there, I think my slide is missing some text here, and I apologize for that. Basically, this pie chart has no numbers on it for some reason, but it is the take-home message here is supposed to be that out of the $32.31 billion NIH budget, about $27 billion, the vast majority of that, does go out to fund R&D activities and not stay in the NIH. Looking at the NIH categorical spending, and this graph is actually last year's categorical spending, but the two figures up top in red are from this year's budget, and that is almost $12 billion for clinical research and $3.3 billion for actual clinical trials. So there are very large sums of money going to fund clinical activities in the life sciences, and this again is just the NIH. A common misconception about non-dilutive funding is that it is primarily for early stage, basic research, early development, and while there's definitely money out there for that. That's very true. There is definitely money out there for clinical stage research, as my previous slide demonstrated fairly well. If you look at that graph, the highest bar was clinical research. And this is really one of the most important take-home messages I hope you do remember from this talk. Excuse me. Looking at a few examples, this is a recent success story of ours. PolyNovo, an Australian company, was recently, and this is, I think they were awarded late September. This news clipping is from October 3rd. But they were awarded potentially up to $26 million. Initially, it was about $8.2 million, and if they meet the milestones, a total of $26.3 million in funding for their clinical trials, and this was in wound care. And not surprisingly, you can see the bottom news clipping, what's happening with the PolyNovo share price. These things obviously have many effects that are beyond the actual dollar sum. Receiving this type of an award can be a real important milestone for a company in many, many ways. And this is maybe the best example of something like that. And NMR, another client of ours, past client actually, and they went through Series A, Series B. They really reached a kind of make or break point. We were able to help them raise a $21 million BARDA contract, and within a year they were bought. So again, another a case study here that really drives home the message of the importance of this type of funding for clinical activities, even beyond the fact that they will actually fund your clinical trials. This really brings a lot of value with it beyond that. Taking a step forward and really looking at the actual mechanisms that are used typically to fund this type of activity. So first of all, and this is for U.S. organizations only, the first example, but most of the others are actually open regardless of where you are. Excuse me. So phase 2 or fast track SBIRs can be used to fund clinical activities, and we will be looking at some example solicitations that are SBIRs in today's webinar, so stay tuned for that. You could, by the way, also use, and this is something I'm not necessarily going to describe, so I'll mention this now, even if there's not an SBIR specific solicitation for clinical trials in the specific area of science that you are looking to conduct yours, you can definitely use the parent direct to phase 2 if you have not yet received a phase 1, or definitely a regular phase 2 if you have received a phase 1. And that will fund clinical trials in any area of research. Sometimes those can be a little bit harder to get very, very high dollar amounts on, but you can always do a phase 2B after that to increase the funding. Research project grants, and this is really the bread and butter of the NIH and R01. They fund all sorts of activities, but this is definitely one of the mechanisms they use to fund clinical activities as well. Another mechanism that is used, and this one fairly heavily, to fund clinical stage R&D is the UO1s and the cooperative agreements in general. Basically, the main difference between a UO1 and an R01 is that it's a bit more hands-on the side of the funding agency. They don't make decisions for you or take control of a project in any way, shape, or form, but they do expect more frequent updates. They like to be a bit more involved in part of the process, give advice during either the planning or the actual while you're conducting the research. And that type of involvement actually we have found, well, not we have found, but our clients have found in the past to be actually very useful. By the way, I failed to mention this, but I will be sending out the slides of this webinar, so no need to take any notes or anything like that. Everybody who registered will be receiving the slides. And also, if you do have questions, please do feel free to add them in the question box, and I'll try to answer as many of them as I can towards the end of the webinar. But back to the actual topic. UH2 and UH3s are actually kind of a combination between the UO1 and the SBIRs. They're not SBIRs, so they're definitely not only for small businesses in the United States. They're open in that sense, but they're phased like SBIRs. So there's the UH2 phase and the UH3 phase, and it is a cooperative agreement. So it's, like I mentioned for the previous example, a bit more hands-on in terms of the agency. And broad agency announcements, usually utilized by organizations like BARDA and the Department of Defense. They're typically fairly broad announcement, that hence the name. It defines a specific area of science, but within that science, very broad, very few guidelines within that general area. And let's move forward. When you're trying to get a clinical trial funded, there are a few main differences to remember when approaching the funding agency and producing the application. First of all, having a clinical protocol is usually necessary to submit. Not always, usually, but even when it is not necessary, you at least need to have a draft. You have to have a real understanding of what the actual activities you're planning to do are. It is really impossible to produce a high quality application without having that in advance. The investigator brochure is definitely highly recommended, and it can be very helpful. Not always necessary, but very helpful. Having the clinical sites mapped out and the site PIs and letters of support from the PIs, not necessarily required, but again, very helpful, especially in cases like, you need to have a letter from a specific site saying they can recruit a certain amount of people within the period of time designated by the project, things like that. It goes a long way to convey to the funding agency that you have a real understanding of what you're looking to carry out and that it is feasible and possible. IND may be required with some sources to submit, definitely required in all cases to receive the award, but sometimes also required to submit. Main two examples of that that we'll discuss today are probably the FDA and the CDMRPs. But generally speaking, not always is this required at the point of submission, but you definitely need to receive an IND to conduct a clinical trial and therefore to receive the award. IRB is usually not required at the point of submission. As I mentioned, for INDs, you definitely need this to conduct a clinical trial, so you will eventually need to have this in place to actually receive the award, but you do not have to wait until everything's mapped out completely to submit your application. A very important note that please do remember this, if very few other things. Contact the program officers in advance. Try very hard not to make the first time they hear of your project when they actually receive the submitted application. Not saying it's impossible to be awarded that way, but not having that happen will go a long way towards the chances of success. So let's look at the actual sources of funding. And the first thing I'd like to do is touch on a type of mechanism that does not actually fund clinical activities, but it's more designed to help you be ready to fund those clinical activities. And as an example, I touched just now on a few things that you should either definitely have in place or try to have in place in time. If you do not have those things in place, something you can do is file a clinical trial planning grant. Or an R34, and sometimes there are U34s as well. But generally speaking, these grants are basically a mechanism that funds the activities building up toward the clinical trial, planning it, and more specifically, they fund establishment of the research team, development of tools for data management and research oversight, development of the trial design, finalizing the protocol, preparing operations and procedures manuals, pilot studies even, or collection of feasibility data for subsequent research projects. So they'll also actually fund some very small scale studies. If that the information from that study will go towards justifying the actual main study. Typically, about $450,000 is the cap over up to 3 years, and this is the official cap. In many ways, it's hard to justify 3 years of preparing for a clinical trial, so that may be a bit of a reach there. We would probably recommend not going over 150,000 for a year, but these are the definite guidelines, and an important thing is you have to justify what you're asking for. So don't just ask for $450,000 because you can. You have to outline the activities you're looking to carry out and ask for the actual costs. They're designed to permit early peer review of the rationale and concept for the trial. They support development of essential elements of the clinical trial and eventually lead to an application for support of a full-scale trial. Two things that I think are very important about this type of mechanism, more so than the actual funds in many ways. First of all, this can, in many cases, be kind of getting your foot in the door. If you are awarded a clinical trial planning grant, it means they're very interested in your clinical trial. It means they'll help you, depending on the mechanism, an R34 or U34, different levels of involvement. But regardless, they're interested in making the clinical trial eventually that you're going to plan as close to what they're looking to fund as possible. And this is a real way to increase your chances of receiving subsequently funding for the actual clinical trial. And maybe most importantly, both of these points are actually pretty important, but since you submit an application here to the NIH, you will receive a summary statement. And regardless of being awarded or not, what you'll receive with that summary statement is some of the top scientists in the world reviewing your plan for the clinical trial and telling you what they like and what they don't like, what they think you should change, how they think you should change it. This is things that some people pay top dollar for consultants to do, and you can get this for absolutely no cost by submitting this type of a planning grant. So that's something that has a lot of value that many people don't realize. So I definitely suggest submitting this type of grant when relevant. And if you are at a phase in your development that this could be relevant for, the upcoming deadline is actually June 16th, which is not that far in the future. So please do feel free to look into this, and this is a great mechanism to use. Actually, not one mechanism. I'm talking about it as if it's one mechanism, but as you'll see in a second, there are various different U and R34s. Different agencies within the NIH have different mechanisms, but it covers most areas of research. The NIA, the National Institute on Aging, NEI, National Eye Institute, and National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, allergies and infectious diseases, really across the board. You can see these are not all the examples. Most areas of research have clinical trial planning grants, and it is a great mechanism to utilize when relevant. But enough about that. Let's talk about the actual clinical funding. So first of all, still within the NIH, we'll look at a few examples here, and there are others that I won't touch on, but I'm trying to bring you most of the prominent examples. So this is the NIAID Clinical Trial Implementation Cooperative Agreement. And this basically funds activities across the board in the areas of interest to NIAID. It says trials must be related to the research mission of the NIAID. So essentially anything related to the mission of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, which is infectious diseases, allergies, and autoimmune diseases. So it's pretty broad. And you can check out their website to get a bit more detail on that. But basically this mechanism has no budget cap, which is fantastic. And a lot of the clinical stage mechanisms do not have a budget cap. You'll see some do, but a lot of them do not. That being said, and I'll say this one more time and then I'll stop saying this, but this is going to be relevant for any mechanism that does not have a budget cap. And actually, even for those that do have budget caps, you must ask for something that truly does reflect the scope of work. Don't ask for too much and don't ask for too little. This also has a R01 equivalent for non-high-risk clinical trials. This is actually for high-risk clinical trials. You can look at the NIH definition of what a high-risk clinical trial is and what a non-high-risk clinical trial is, but in all honesty, almost all clinical trials, by their definition, are considered high-risk clinical trials. So I didn't bring the example of the R01, but if your clinical trial is not considered a high-risk clinical trial, then definitely use the R01 mechanism, not the U01. The upcoming deadline is in the very near future, May 13th. Still probably feasible to meet, but you should contact the program officer literally today if you want to meet this deadline. They also have an SBIR Phase 2 Clinical Trial Implementation Cooperative Agreement, and this is again NIAID as well. In terms of the funding, and I took this text from the actual solicitation. I won't read it verbatim, but basically they're saying, because the SBA has a $1.5 million cap on Phase 2 SBIRs, but what they're saying here is basically, and this is true for all Phase 2 SBIRs, the only reason they're specifically stating this in this case, that the NIH can apply for a waiver for that cap when they feel that cap will interfere with their ability to meet their mission. They usually don't state that, even though it's always true. The reason they state it within this solicitation it's a fairly frequent occurrence when using this mechanism because it funds clinical trials. So basically the standard cap, if the NIH do not apply to the SBA for a waiver for you, is $1.5 million. But and again, this is something you have to find out while contacting the program officer in advance. But in many cases, it can be exceeded substantially. And in terms of the scope, it is very similar to the previous mechanism, but this is only for US-based small businesses. That is the main difference. So there's a bit less competition if you are a US small business. That being said, with the previous example, you don't have to deal with the potential budget cap. The same deadline as the previous mechanism, May 13th. Again, get going very quickly if you're considering applying to this deadline. Another good example is from the NHLBI, the National Institute of Heart, Lung, and Blood, actually the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, excuse me. And this, again, no budget cap, must reflect the scope of work. And this basically is very similar to the NIAID equivalent that I mentioned earlier, but it has to meet basically the goals of the mission of the NHLBI, which are different because they're interested in heart, lungs, and blood. But within that pretty wide area of research, there are no specifications. So if you're in that area, this is a good mechanism for you. And this funds phase 2 and 3 clinical trials. When I do not specify the phases that the mechanism will fund, you can take it basically as the fact that they do not have any requirements in that sense. But if you see obviously a mechanism that funds up to $4 million, you can be pretty sure they're not looking to fund a phase 3 clinical trial. This deadline is June 5th. So again, not very far in the future, especially since, like I mentioned, you should definitely be in contact with the NIH in advance. So again, if this is up your alley, please do get going as soon as possible. The NIDDK, Multi-Center Clinical Study Cooperative Agreement, funds, similarly enough, clinical trials that are related to the mission of the NIDDK, which is National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive Disorders, and Kidney Diseases. And so pretty much anything in that area is very relevant. Gastrointestinal, they do a lot of research. You should really look at their mission in a more detailed fashion to be 100% sure if this is within their scope or not for you. But generally speaking, one major difference here is they only fund multi-center clinical trials. So if your clinical trial is not a multi-center clinical trial, then this would not be relevant. Deadline here is again June 5th. And there are a lot of other examples. I chose a few here, but again, this is not the whole list. So there are 2 separate mechanisms for Alzheimer's, one for phase 1 and phase 2, a separate mechanism for phase 3 clinical trials in the Alzheimer space. Chronic pain, psychiatric disorders, dental and craniofacial, communication disorders. There are a lot of different areas of research that the NIH funds clinical trials in, and I highly encourage you to take a closer look if one of these or something else is your area of research. Very well could be a mechanism for you that I did not bring here as an example. Something I didn't touch on at all, and I will touch on now, is the NIDS and in general the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system area of research. The NIDS has many clinical trial funding mechanisms, and I've brought a few examples here. SBIRs and collaborative SBIRs and UO1s, and you'll see in the next page there are also UH2, UH3s, really a lot of different mechanisms depending on specifically within the neuro space where you are located. There is most definitely, in this space more than any other space, there is definitely a funding mechanism out there that could fund your R&D activities at the clinical stages. So neuro is a very good area to be in terms of funding clinical trials. Now that we're done with the NIH, we'll touch on BARDA. BARDA are a fantastic agency to work with on many levels. First of all, they're extremely approachable, probably more so than any other funding agency, at least I am aware of. You can even reach out to them, set up a meeting. They call it a tech watch, wherein they will actually, You send them obviously your materials and then kind of an outline of what you're doing and how you're doing it and where you're positioned. And they'll meet with you and then tell you, okay, we like this, we're not so crazy about this, we would like you to do A, B, and C, and then we think you're ready for our funding. They're extremely approachable, they're very nice people. And another very serious added value in receiving funding from BARDA is that because the BARDA mission is not only to fund this type of research, and by the way, when I say this type of research, it's basically chemical, biological, radiological threats, pandemic influenza, medical countermeasures, things like that. And part of their mission is to stockpile these countermeasures. So not only will they fund your activities, they will also, upon receiving the hopefully receiving the FDA approval and having an actual product on the market, they will buy it from you in bulk. So not only will you have somebody to fund your research, you'll have to have your first major client as well. Currently, there are 3 BAAs, broad agency announcements, open from BARDA. So one is the Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Medical Countermeasures BAA. And basically it covers anything within those areas. Clinical trials within those areas are definitely something that you should submit to this mechanism. BARDA have, without a doubt, the largest awards, sometimes over 100 million. The largest one we've won with them, I think, was about 60 something million. I think it was 61 or 62 million. But there are even, very recently, there have been, I think the highest one that was in the last few months was about 120 million. So they have huge awards. The second one, excuse me, is medical countermeasures for pandemic influenza. There's a BAA specifically for influenza. If you're developing a countermeasure for influenza, regardless of the type of countermeasure you're developing, they may very well be interested, and I highly suggest you reaching out to them and setting up that meeting, the Tech Watch I mentioned. The third one that's currently open is for medical countermeasures against infectious diseases. So this could be, in terms of the scope, basically usually they focus on category A, B, and C pathogens as defined typically by the CDC. And you can check out that list online. But generally speaking, most infectious diseases that are of major relevance in the market are on that list. And if you're developing a countermeasure for an infectious disease, again, I highly suggest reaching out to BARDA if you're at the right stage. If you're currently, in early stages in an animal model, they'll be nice about it, but they'll say, listen, you're not ready. That being said, by the way, you can definitely reach out in advance to understand how you should design the remaining preclinical activities to arrive at the right time with the right information in hand. So actually reaching out to BARDA is not necessarily a bad idea, even if you're not quite ready. The FDA have a couple funding mechanisms. One of them predominantly is relevant here, and that is the Clinical Studies of Safety and Effectiveness on Orphan Product Research Project Grant. This is an R01 funded by the FDA itself. This is only relevant for orphan indications. But if you do have orphan designation, they fund phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. The deadline is once a year in February, so you kind of missed it for this year. But it's a great mechanism, and obviously if you're receiving funding from the FDA, you're in good hands. So this is definitely something to look into if you have orphan designation. This, by the way, funds up to $2 million. Another source of funding, and this is a very interesting source of funding, is the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs, or the CDMRPs in short, and this is under the Department of Defense. This year's CDMRPs, most of them have not been issued yet. They're issued once a year, usually towards the end of Q1 or early Q2. And we're going to have an entire webinar in a few weeks devoted specifically to the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, so definitely stay tuned for that. But this is a source of funding that very consistently funds clinical activities, and there are two programs that have been issued for this year. One of them has a clinical trial award, and there have been press releases for various others, not really issued yet, but I'll touch on those as well. At least from the current press releases, those that discuss clinical trial awards, I'll give examples of those as well. But to get the full picture, you will have to wait a few weeks. Typically, it should be, most of the programs should be announced very soon. So one of the two that have been announced so far, by the way, are breast cancer and ALS. The ALS this year does not have a clinical trial award, but the breast cancer research program, or the BCRP, definitely does. There are a few funding levels. There's 1, 2, 3, and 4, but the mechanism for the levels 3 and 4 are the ones that are relevant for funding clinical trials, and that's why we'll be discussing them here. Before I go into exactly how they work and when you should submit a level 3 or a level 4, the application due date, well, actually the pre-application due date is April 27th. So that is very soon. Maybe I should touch before that on how it works, because it works a bit differently than the NIH and BAAs. Well, BAs sometimes work this way as well. BAs work in a few different ways, but with the CDMRPs, you typically, and this is a good example of that, start with a pre-application. That is or a white paper, a quad chart. There are a few terms for that, but basically, you start with a very short document. You submit a 2, 3, 5, sometimes 8-page document, but it's a very short document in relation to most applications, and definitely in relation to clinical stage applications. And this is actually the major cutoff. So most of the applications are not actually asked to submit a full application. If you are asked to submit a full application, the full application due date will be August 11th this year, but you cannot just submit a full application. The only people that will be eligible to submit a full application will be those who submitted a pre-application before April 27th, and their pre-application was favorably reviewed, and they've been asked to submit a full application. So the full application is by invitation only. When deciding to submit a level 3 or a level 4, basically, and this is exactly from their solicitation. So funding level 3 funds advanced translational studies that have potential for near-term clinical investigation and small-scale clinical trials. And funding level 4 is large-scale projects that will transform or revolutionize the clinical management or prevention of breast cancer. Near-term clinical impact is expected. So funding level 4 for most clinical trials. And that's up to 10 million plus indirect costs. Depending on the type of organization you are, it could be, I would say, a pretty standard cap on the indirect cost for most companies is about 40%. So 40% on top of, as an example, 10 million is actually 14 million. So that's a pretty decent award. The spinal cord injury program has not been announced this year, but they have released a press release excuse me, announcing that there will be a clinical trial award, and so the details will be in the coming weeks. But they announced 2 million plus indirect cost cap, so probably a bit short of 3 million in total. So if you're in the spinal cord injury area, definitely stay tuned for the full announcement coming very soon. And this is really a great source within the CDMRPs, and this is a recurring program, the peer-reviewed medical research program. Every year they have various different topics, and they fund clinical trials pretty much every year. This year is no exception. They do have, this is again based on the press release, so we don't have a deadline yet, but within the press release they already announced, not issued, the 2016 topic areas. And you can see there are actually 39 different topic areas this year, various different areas of research, diabetes, lung injury, influenza, really across the board, just selecting a few here. Look through these. I'm assuming many of these could be relevant for many of the listeners here today. Typically, and this, by the way, has been announced as well for this year, applications are not capped. So this is, again, one of those mechanisms that you do have to justify what you ask for, but no sum is beyond the cap of what they're willing to fund, so long as they feel that you justify what you ask for, and they like your approach, and they feel it's significant and really meeting an unmet medical need. So this is definitely something to keep in mind. Very, very broad in terms of the scope that they are willing to fund. So those are the mechanisms I brought you today for kind of your consideration. Like I said, there are others that I couldn't have time to talk about all of them, but I think those are probably the best examples. And I tried to touch on as many areas of research as possible. A few words about the actual review process of an application, and this is taken from the NIH website, but this is very true regardless of the source of funding. More than anything else, the review process is a risk management or a risk assessment process. They're weighing the strengths of your proposition against the risks that it entails, and presenting your application in the best way possible to convey the strengths in a good way, but also make sure you are aware of the risks and you're prepared to deal with them if any of such situations arise. That is the best way to make sure you are awarded. Basically, there are 5 criteria that the NIH use to judge applications on. Leadership: do you have the proper leadership, the PIs, the high-level executive making the decisions, the people that are truly associated with the project? Are they the right people? Do you have the right environment? Do you have the lab space, everything necessary to conduct the research? In this case, do you have also the clinical sites? And again, not always required, but it helps. Is this of significance? Are you really meeting an unmet medical need? Is this something that will make a difference in people's lives? That, in the end of the day, is what they're looking to. They're also looking definitely not just to make a difference. Let's be real here. They're also looking financially to reduce the healthcare burden in the United States. But those two things, in many cases, come hand in hand. And is it innovative? Is this something that has not been done? Is it truly a real innovation? If the answers to all those 4 things are yes, then you have a good chance to be awarded. But what really will make the difference between being awarded and not being awarded is a top-notch scientific approach. That, at the end of the day, is what gets grants awarded. And that really is how these applications are reviewed. In terms of our, I guess, advice on how to maximize your chances, so first of all, know the interests of the agency. Make sure, like I said, you speak with the program officer. I can't stress that enough. Make sure that they're looking to fund activities similar to what you're proposing. You need to know what the current trends are and really what is interesting to them at the moment. Many, actually almost all of the opportunities I presented you today are very wide in terms of their scope. But within that wide scope, there are definitely areas that are of a bit more interest and of a bit less interest to the funding agencies. And that is something you should definitely map out in advance. You have to present a complete and focused application, cover all the different facets. If there's a certain set of capabilities that's missing from your team, by all means, get somebody to consult that does have that set of capabilities. Excuse me. And also, you need to ask, and I've stressed this a few times now, so maybe I'll skip this, but ask for what's necessary. And leverage, when relevant, on research collaborations. This kind of touches on what I said about presenting a complete and focused application. When there's a certain set of capabilities that you do not have in-house, by all means, collaborate. Do not collaborate just for the sake of collaboration. Don't put a name on your application because it's a hot name and a good university and you're collaborating with them for no reason. They will see through that. They will see that this person's contribution or this institute's contribution to the project is negligible and it will mean nothing. But if there is something that is important for the project, by all means try to collaborate with somebody and have that person to be a leader in their field. That's definitely something that can help. Targeting the right mechanism is important. In this case, it's very important, but this is more in terms of the strategy in general because there are specific mechanisms for clinical stage funding and usually they're very open in terms of scope. But generally speaking, there are a lot of different pockets of money out there with different sizes of awards and success rates. You have to really, to use non-dilutive funding as a strategic tool to fund your activities, you need to conduct a thorough strategic assessment and understand what of your pipeline activities is relevant for what source, when the deadlines are, and treat it seriously. Say, okay, we're going to produce this at this date, then we're going to go ahead and produce this application to that organization, and we're going to take what we wrote here and reformat it and make sure it adheres to the guidelines in this agency and submit it there, and really create what we call a multi-submission granting strategy. That, in our experience, is the only way to take non-dilutive funding, grantsmanship, call it what you may, and make it something that's really consistently produces result and can be treated as a strategic source of funding for a company. Our professional process basically takes that into account, and one of the two core services we provide is that strategic assessment, strategic consulting, and the other is the actual grant production process. And those things go hand in hand, and it's actually kind of a circle where the strategic assessment is not only something we do in the beginning of the relationship, it's also obviously an ongoing process. So we're currently revising the strategy and suggesting new opportunities, and then obviously also going back and producing the applications with the clients. So generally speaking, it usually starts with the upper left corner here, the R&D funding needs of the client. We create a multi-submission strategy, a short-term strategy for the next few months of what we're going to produce immediately, produce the grants. Hopefully they're favorably reviewed and awarded, and around we go. So that has been our webinar for today. At this point, I will take a few of the questions that have been written in, and also if you have questions at this point, please do feel free to add them. I'm just going to go ahead here. Let me just see here. So I have, how is U44 different from an R34, U34? U34, R34 is the clinical trial planning grant, and a U44 is a phase 2 SBIR collaborative agreement. One is designed to fund the preparation for a clinical trial, and one is designed to fund for small U.S. businesses more advanced development activities, and one of those things can be a clinical trial. So I hope that answers your question. Let me see here. Okay, this one is a very long and specific question. I'll try to answer this by email. What is an IND? An investigational new drug. It's a designation you have to have from the FDA, FDA, in order to start a clinical trial. Okay. Okay, this is an interesting question. Let me see if I can summarize this. Okay, so most grants are hypothesis driven, and a clinical trial is not necessarily hypothesis driven. Do you have to present the clinical trial as something that is hypothesis driven? The answer is yes. You do have to present it in that way, and that can be sometimes part of the challenge of producing an application, kind of translating, I guess, the clinical protocol into a grant, which is not always completely straightforward. So that's a very good question, and sometimes the clinical trial is hypothesis driven, and that presents different challenges. But yes, that's a very good question, and the answer is yes. You usually do have to present it as a hypothesis driven project. Another good question here is about, does the trial have to involve a new entity, or would these mechanisms fund reformulations, and this is not part of the question, but I'll also say the same thing is true also for repurposing. And the answer is yes. Almost across the board, everything I mentioned here today, so long as the repurposed or the reformulated drug has real relevance in terms of meeting an unmet medical need, in terms of being significant, in terms of having a better, I don't know, safety profile or better efficacy, absolutely. They will definitely fund that type of activity. And I think that's it for now. Well, if I missed any of your questions, I will definitely try to answer them by email. Thank you all for attending today. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and I will, as I mentioned, be sending out the slides. Also, this has been recorded and will probably be on our YouTube channel very soon. So thank you very much for joining us today, and best of luck with your applications.